Back tonight, John in Focus. Thanks for staying on. And conversation continues now as we focus on immigration in South Africa. Johannesburg-based think tank, the Brenthurst Foundation, says South Africa doesn't actually know how many undocumented migrants are in the country. Research by the foundation has also shown light on negative attitudes towards foreigners, exaggerations about their impact on resources, and myths allegedly perpetuated by politicians and those with access to media. Joining us now to clarify the findings is Dr. Emmanuel Owusu-Sekyere, Deputy Director of Research at the Brenthurst Foundation. Dr. Emmanuel, good evening. Good to have you with us tonight here on In Focus. You're arguing the fact that we don't actually know how many undocumented migrants there are in the country. To what do you attribute this systemic problem?
Well, good evening, Tabo, and hello to your viewers. Through our research, we found out that, and also the nature of the porousness of the borders, South Africa's borders, with neighboring countries shows that there are several crossings from other countries to South Africa that are not documented. A number of factors actually propagate this. First of all, these boundaries were created by colonialists. They are not African-made boundaries. So in several border towns, you find that the communities are very closely integrated, intermarried, they speak the same language. If you take 2 steps forward, you're in a different country. 2 steps backwards, you're in South Africa. And there are no real enforceable boundaries. These are basically imaginary boundaries between the communities. You find that families live across on both sides. So people cross to work and go back the following day. So the very nature of African communities along the borders is such that it's very difficult to enforce these imaginary boundaries and lines within those communities. The other challenge is that it's very difficult to monitor how many people cross the border in South Africa or in the other direction on a daily basis, especially when they're not coming through the demarcated entry points.
Yeah. South Africans would say, particularly, for example, if we look at what happened in Newzroom in the West End and the number of arrests that were effected there, we are told that the police arrested those who they believe have got no documents, are undocumented migrants. And South Africans would say it's not just populist rhetoric. It's not just influential people speaking in the media. There is certainly a degree of illegality as far as documentation and immigration is concerned in the country. And this is what we have been talking about.
Well, that is correct. But you need to separate crime from ordinary migrants crossing the border. Crime is crime. There is those who have crossed into the country committing all kinds of crimes, and that the law enforcement has to deal with that effectively and make sure they are arrested and prosecuted and jailed. And then they are different from the ordinary migrant who is running away from political persecution or economic hardship and is trying to make ends meet or look for something to do or a job to do. Those are 2 separate things. And in South Africa in general, several research projects have shown there's a general anti-foreigner sentiment driven by different kinds of factors, some legitimate, some perception, some speculation, some imaginary. And we've had instances where politicians thrive on these anti-migrant sentiments, driving the populace for South Africans' minds away from their real challenges of unemployment, the high levels of corruption, the low GDP growth, the high levels of poverty, the high levels of crime, the actual issues that need to be dealt with, the inconsistent electricity supply, and the challenges that South Africans actually have, the poverty, inequality, unemployment. Those are the issues that South Africa really has, and the politicians need to be dealing with. But every now and then you see this whipping up of anti-foreigner sentiments, and you see this vigilante style going around and populist moves, driving South Africans' minds away from the actual challenges they should actually be holding their politicians to account on. And that you've seen happen several times. I think they are separate issues. We need to separate those issues. Crime is crime. Police and law enforcement must work irrespective of where they are coming from. Crime has no nationality. Arrest them, prosecute them, jail them. You have everybody's support on that.
In your report, you seem to be taking a sentiment that says you want, for example, particularly to address the issues that have been raised by Action SA's Herman Mashaba. Why particularly him when of course there have been a lot of other leaders as well that have raised issues around undocumented foreign nationals?
I think in his manifesto, he overestimates the number of, the ratio of migrant population to GDP, South Africa's population to 10%, which is much, much less. And there's also the constant narrative from Action SA that the presence of migrants is robbing South Africans of their jobs. That is not 100% correct. There are certain specific sectors that have those challenges, like the truck drivers, for instance, and probably the restaurant workers. You know, there are specific sectors that you could say that about, but not blanket across the entire economy. So I think some of those rhetoric has to be classified and properly narrated, because you fuel already deeply seated anti-migrant sentiments that result in very devastating consequences for a lot of migrants. And any migrant walking down, I'm a professor of economics. If I'm walking down the street in a jeans and a t-shirt, nothing shows I'm documented. It's not written on my forehead. It's not written on my chest or my clothes. I'm a documented foreign national. So it's very difficult to pick a documented from undocumented foreign national if you're not a Home Affairs officer or the police inspecting documents. So when you whip up sentiments and you have violence and chaos in town, you could find yourself at the wrong place at the wrong time on any day, and the consequences can be very devastating. So politicians need to be careful how the kind of rhetorics they use and how they narrate these things, how they address these things in general in South Africa.
Yeah. So let's look then at what we know then. You are saying there's administrative violence meted against foreign nationals, saying this is a reality. So a number of conversations that I've had with the minister, he says himself that there is no such a thing. In fact, lots of documents are issued to foreign nationals in the country. I mean, it gives you a quantum of how many they issue a month, a number of those being for people from Zimbabwe and so on and so forth, saying there is a lot that is being done at Home Affairs to ensure that people are given the necessary documents. Yes, there are some glitches in the system, old systems that need to be enhanced. There are some officials there that need to be sorted out. We have some elements of criminality in terms of their dealings. But also there are foreign nationals who are abusing the system. For example, taking advantage of the spousal visa, employment visa, study visa, and so on and so forth. So you say there is a degree of administrative violence being meted out against particularly those who seek asylum in the country.
Now, each of the descriptions you've made are actually correct, and each of them apply. Now, there are those who get their documentation normally. When everything is correct, Home Affairs process your documentation, get the correct documentation. In our study on migrant experiences with COVID-19 in South Africa, we came across quite a number of refugees and asylum seekers that we spoke to. In fact, we spoke to different kinds of non-nationals, asylum seekers, critical skills, documented, undocumented. And we found that the asylum seekers and refugees, most of them had their documents, for most of them, their documents had expired. And we found that the documents had expired because most processing centers for asylum seekers and refugees had closed since COVID, some since 2012. So those whose documents had expired could not renew their documents and had become irregular or undocumented, not because they didn't want to, but because the centers had closed. Now, you also mentioned, which is correct, the fact that there are some corrupt elements in Home Affairs that take advantage of these foreign nationals who genuinely want to process their documents and get them regularized. And they go through all kinds of horrible experiences in the process. And of course, the non-nationals are also not entirely innocent. There are some that try to take advantage of the system. So each of these scenarios are accurate, and each of these scenarios does apply. But the ones that we came across in our study, you find a genuine person trying to regularize the document, but the center is closed. And there's been a court order from, I think, Newzroom Foundation to the Home Affairs Court. And the court order was the Home Affairs must open those processing centers. But you'd agree with me that the court order alone does not provide the logistics and the personnel and what is required to get the offices open. So the offices are still closed. So it takes time to get these things up to speed and up and kicking and operating like they used to before all this happened. So there is some administrative bias to approach Home Affairs to get their documents regularized. It's quite an experience to go to Home Affairs offices and join the queue and try to get something done. The experience is not that pleasant for most people, most foreign nationals that try to. But I must admit, though, that under the current minister, a lot has improved, and he's doing a great job.
So we've seen, for example, the Department of Higher Education having revised, alongside Home Affairs, some of the lists in terms of critical skills lists in the country, what they deem as critical skills. Is the country, through that kind of program, blocking critical skills from coming in the country, but also, in a sense, chasing away critical skills in the country to go elsewhere?
The challenge with the critical skills list is that South Africa has the reactive policy stance on that. What do I mean by that? They wait for you to apply and see with active policy stance. I don't know if you've been following the news and following online. There are several countries recruiting from African countries, including South Africa, as at now. I don't know if I can mention them on this show, but there are several developed countries recruiting critical skills and skills that they need, because in their countries they have aging populations, people going for early retirements. After COVID, most of them did not come back. So they have acute shortage of skills, and the grocery shop for skills is Africa. For the rest of the world is Africa. So right in front of our noses, they are poaching South Africans, they are poaching foreign nationals with critical skills, and that is the challenge for South Africa. South Africa needs to compete with these more developed, richer countries for these few critical skills that Africa has. So if you notice carefully, the rate of emigration is increased in South Africa. Skilled South Africans are leaving, high net worth South Africans are leaving with their capital and financial muscle. And it's not just in South Africa. In most African countries, that trend is currently on increasing. And you have a few critical skills and high net worth people leaving because other countries have this proactive policy stance where they're actually headhunting and poaching and approaching and sending emails. I get several emails every month from different countries asking, won't you like to migrate? We have vacancies for these positions. South Africa is not proactive enough. South Africa is not competing enough for the skills that it needs. So you look back one day and most of the people you need to help grow the economy are gone. Because they're not only recruiting South Africans, they're recruiting other nationals. Whoever has the skill they need, they are recruiting the person. So that's the challenge with the critical skills. Not so much what's on the list or what's not on the list. The competition for the little skills that there is.
In your survey, do you find that there are undocumented migrants who are highly educated, highly skilled people who are worth paying attention to?
Oh, yes, there are. I've come across a gardener who's a qualified degree teacher. My barber is a chartered accountant. My personal barber is a chartered accountant. But he has no documentation, so he cuts hair because he knows how to cut hair. It's a fantastic barber. So I think if Home Affairs can have a way of scanning through or engaging these people, they'll be able to find among them some of the critical skills they need. Some of them are highly skilled people, but they came across the border running for their dear lives or having to look for greener pastures somewhere else. And they don't have the right documentation to work in their respective areas of expertise. So they found something else to do to survive. But there are some people among them that are very highly skilled that could be of good use in South Africa.
The issue of documentation is not a challenge just for adult people. It is a big challenge, you're saying, for children as well of non-nationals. How does this present itself?
If you're undocumented and have a child in South Africa, your baby is also undocumented or becomes stateless. You can become stateless either through birth or through a change in the law. You either assume the nationality of your parents or where you were born. And let me also put a balance on this. It's not only for foreign nationals who have children or babies of foreign nationals or children born to foreign nationals. It's also a challenge for some South African mothers as well, who for some reason or the other couldn't acquire a birth certificate for their babies when they were born. It becomes very difficult to do that later, and the kids end up having no birth certificates and having no evidence that they were born in South Africa. And sometimes we ignore it till the child is 16 or 17 and has to write matric and needs an ID, and then you realize that he's not on record. There's no data on that child. So it's a challenge for not just babies born to non-nationals, but also for South African mothers as well, who could not register their kids at the time of birth.
Now, the Home Affairs Department recently announced the Border Management Authority, at least the first deployment thereof. There's been a number of articles being written, including arguments by experts on whether or not this will be able to help the situation. One expert saying that the program clearly was not going to succeed because it was not a clear policy, but rather a reaction. People will always try to go through those fences. What South Africa's government needs to do is come up with a clear foreign policy position around the situation. What would you say to that? I mean, would a Border Patrol Management Authority assist, or is there something bigger that would need to happen as far as getting a handle on the immigration issue in the country?
There are certain parts of the border that needs to be strengthened, and therefore the Border Patrol is a very good idea. You would agree with me that several cars that are stolen, in fact my sister-in-law's car was recently stolen and they attempted to cross the border into Zimbabwe with it. It's the soldiers at the border that arrested them, that caught them. So in terms of controlling crime and the spread of narcotics and ammunition and all kinds of negative vices, the border control is very important. So a certain part of the border is a very, very important thing. Where you have ordinary people crossing, I would suggest several research projects have shown that when it is easier for people to approach the right border crossings, be documented for how long they're staying, the incentive to stay in South Africa is eroded, is removed. People stay and hide in the system because it's very difficult to get here. If they can come in and come out anytime they want, and they can be monitored, and they can be traced, and they can be documented, the incentive to stay in South Africa will be totally eliminated. So we need to be able to differentiate between people who are crossing to buy groceries, people who are crossing to, there's a very high, in fact, 60 to 70% of intra-Africa trade is cross-border trade done by women and children. So the AFCFTA we talk about, majority of that will be done by cross-border trade, informal cross-border trade. So we need to look at how we can manage differentiating between the different kinds of people crossing in order not to stifle cross-border trade and economic activity, whilst at the same time mitigating crime and stopping the negative vices from happening. So in certain instances and issues, it is justified. But we need to be able to differentiate between the people who are crossing. They are not the same kind of, they are different kinds of people crossing for different reasons and different purposes. And we need to, as much as we want to control the crime and the negative vices, we should also cripple the positive side of movement of people across borders, because there's a high level of trade and economic activity that happens in those spaces.
Dr. Emmanuel, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on and joining us tonight here on In Focus. That is the Brenthurst Foundation Deputy Director of Research, Dr. Emmanuel Owusu-Sekyere.